Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another entry into our series for Kaspersky Unified Monitoring and Analysis Platform. In this particular episode, which is episode number 12, we are going to talk about the resources and the usage and the operation in general surrounding tenants. So, tenants allow us to separate user access to specific data. On the one hand, all resources, events, assets, and most integration settings are bound to a specific tenant. On the other hand, when creating users, the Kuma administrator lists tenants and their roles in these tenants for users. A user with the head administrator role has access to all of the tenants. Put simply, the use of tenants allows a single Kuma installation to create multiple systems that are isolated from one another and that can be used by different teams of users. Therefore, it often makes sense to create tenants for various subsidiaries or regional offices. This is especially useful tool for the MSSP providers. When installing Kuma, two tenants are created, the shared and the main tenants. We'll talk about them a little later, but for now, let's look at tenants 1 and 2 that I created in the settings section. In each of these tenants, I created one collector and one correlator. Kuma resources cannot exist without being bound to one tenant or the other. So let's see how events are typically being displayed. You can see that all of the events have a tenant in specific column. The collector, having received an event, passes it, it adds it to its tenant, and then sends it out to its tenant's correlator. The tenancy property works here as well. The correlator of tenant number 2 will not be able to process events created in tenant number 1, and of course vice versa. The correlation events will belong to the same tenant as the correlator. But what if you need to correlate events, some of which arrived at tenant number 1's collector, while the other part arrived at tenant number 2's collector? So this is a cross-tenant correlation, and the question is it possible? The answer to that, yes, of course, it's absolutely possible. However, cross-tenant correlation is only available in the main tenant correlators. Therefore, if you look at the event destinations on the collectors, you can see that the past events are sent to the storage, to the correlator of your tenant, and to the main tenant correlator. The main tenant is also important because Kuma core audit events, so for example your user authentication, resource creation, and editing, which of course all require a main tenant. So those are typically going to fall into the tenant's correlators and stores. Otherwise, the main tenant is an ordinary tenant in general. Its collectors accept events the same way the correlators perform correlation. So by installing Kuma with a main tenant, you get a fully functional system. Therefore, you should not delete the main tenant even after you have designed and implemented your own tenant model. However, you can still go ahead and rename it if necessary. The second tenant that appears after Kuma is installed is the shared tenant. Its role is a little bit different. As I mentioned earlier, the services and resources can only be linked to resources within their own tenant. So the shared tenant resources are the exception to this particular rule. There can be no services, no events, no assets in this particular tenant. It is just a library of resources that can be used in all tenants simultaneously. So the rules from a shared tenant can be connected to the correlators of all tenants. So to ensure that the correlation rule works with the same conditions on the correlators of all tenants, we store them in the shared tenant. When you make changes, you only need to change the rule in one single place. To access The access to the shared tenant resources is defined by a separate access modifier. However, the lack of access does not impair functionality whatsoever. For example, if an analyst of a tenant does not have access to shared resources, but the rules in their tenant are accessing the shared tenant's filters, the rule will work perfectly fine. It's just that the content of those filters will not be available to that particular analyst. So how to enable or disable the display of these particular tenants? We clear the checkboxes of the tenant you don't need at that particular moment, and everything will work as before. You just won't see any services, resources, or events from those particular tenants that you have deselected. So now, when building a dashboard, you can list the tenants whose events you want to visualize. If a tenant is no longer needed, it can actually be deleted. This will delete all the resources of that particular tenant, all the events and the services of that tenant will be grayed out unless they have been uninstalled from the operating system. Since this is a critical operation, you will need to manually enter the confirmation code. And as always, ladies and gentlemen, this is the conclusion of the 12th entry into this series on Kaspersky Unified Monitoring and Analysis Platform. As always, thank you so much for watching and see you in the next one. Bye-bye.